Hello, Prestige Heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we're very excited to welcome to the podcast today Vivek Chibber. Vivek's a professor of sociology at NYU. He's also the editor of Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy. And if you haven't checked out Catalyst, it's really good. Some really high-level thinking about socialism and how to achieve it in this country. And he's also the host of a new podcast called Confronting Capitalism. Vivek, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So I guess just the first basic question for people who might have heard about the tariffs but haven't been paying close attention. What precisely has Trump done?
Well, what he's essentially done is placed a tax on all goods coming into the United States of a baseline of 10%, which means any importer who's purchasing a good from outside has to pay a additional 10% on whatever he was going to pay the exporter from the other country. And on top of that 10%, depending on which country we're talking about, he slapped an additional level of tariffs or taxes ranging anywhere from 5% to 40 or 60 or 80%. So it's the biggest hike that we've seen in this kind of taxation of foreign goods, probably around 100 years. The only countries that are partially exempt so far are Mexico and Canada, although they too have been targeted with more specific tariffs on particular goods. But for the rest of the world, it's a baseline of 10% plus X. And there seems to be no rhyme or reason or logic behind how he came up with the individual numbers. And there's a story that he has as to why he's doing it. It's entirely unclear how this action actually justifies the story that he's telling about why he's done it.
Lesotho is not going to take advantage of us anymore. They've been gouging us. The Lesotho, come on.
Yeah. Trump has liberated the U.S. from exploitation.
Yes, exactly. He's liberated us from exploitation of the little Australian islands where there's only penguins that live. It's glorious. I'm
Fuck
curious.
Those penguins,
Exactly. I'm curious what your expectation was, because we knew this was coming. I mean, they'd been hyping Liberation Day for a while now. Your expectation of what Trump was going to do versus the reality of what he actually did.
I'll be honest. I didn't know what to expect. And the reason is that, Trump, not to be glib about this, but Trump has the emotional makeup of a child. And so he'll routinely say things and not do them, or say that he's going to do something in one specific way and then change his mind. So I was genuinely split over whether or not he's simply using the threat of tariffs to extract other kinds of concessions from key countries. Like concessions like, for example, their own trade barriers to the United States, concessions like buying more American goods, or concessions like dealing with diplomatic alliances that he's trying to forge or trying to break. So that was one possibility. And I thought, there's a good 50-50 chance he does that. On the other side, I thought, well, what he might do is slap the tariffs on actual tariffs for a little while, and then use them as a lever to negotiate tariffs themselves and bilateral treaties with other countries. Now, that appears to be what he's done. It appears that what he's done is put into place a level of tariffs that if they remain in place, it'll actually bring the entire global economy down. And knowing that people are going to rush to him to try to fix this, then he will negotiate with them country by country. Now, that's not so as absurd as it sounds. The WTO kind of worked like that for 40 years, which is there was a global trading order, which was supposed to be free trade, but the United States and the WTO, I'm sorry, I'm saying WTO, I meant GATT. The GATT worked like this, where you could negotiate individual bilateral treaties between countries within the umbrella of GATT. It's possible. So I could say that part of my expectation has been fulfilled, but I'd be lying, because the truth is it was at best a 50-50. And I'll say one final thing, Derek. Already it's pretty clear nobody in his administration knew what he was going to do. All the way until yesterday, it appears, no one knew what was coming down. And that's why they had this chatbot come up with the actual tariffs. Because I think some 22-year-old incel in his office came up with the actual tariffs using ChatGPT. Whatever team he used didn't know what was going on. So we're dealing with a fundamentally kind of inchoate and incoherent personality here.
So I want to not to jump to like the worst case scenario, but I think to add to what you're saying of, in terms of it's not obvious what he's trying to do or what he was trying to do. He's incoherent. All of these things is the possibility that they still don't know what they're trying to do, right? Because I've seen all kinds of suggestions from these guys. I've seen suggestions that still he's going to, he's thinking about this in terms of leverage for whatever concessions he wants to get, or he's thinking about it in terms of leveling the trade playing field, or they're thinking about it in terms of a revenue source, like this massive new external revenue service that they're going to build so that they can cut taxes domestically. And these things are fundamentally in contradiction with one another, right? Like if you're negotiating new trade deals, then you're not going to get the revenue. And if you want the revenue, then you can't, negotiate to bring tariffs down. So it seems like they still don't really know what they want out of this.
I think there's no they here, first of all. I was willing to contemplate for some time that this was a situation in which Trump has a vision, and he does have a kind of a vision in his head about what he'd like to do. He doesn't quite know the mechanics of how to implement it. And in Trump 2, as opposed to Trump point 1, he had a team of people around him who were tasked with the responsibility of finding the mechanisms to implement it. So I was willing to contemplate that. If that were true, they would have been a they there. It would have meant that Trump tells people what he wants, they come up with a rational plan to devise it, and then they logically and systematically implement that plan in a way that's consistent with the goals. What appears to be happening here is that he sends people packing to come up with a strategy, and then he sits in his room and he may or may not go along with what they've said. So the they reduces to a he. Now, the question then is, does he have an actual vision or a strategy? He has a vision, but visions can be contradictory, as you're saying. So he wants both to reduce interest rates. He wants to reduce the dollar, and he wants to reduce the trade deficit. But the problem is the things he's doing to lower the value of the dollar could very well increase American exports, which means that the exports are going to now push against the value of the dollar. And either he's not aware of that contradiction, or he just thinks it'll magically pan out some way. So my guess is that he's taken a huge leap in the dark. He has immense confidence in himself that his intuitions can substitute for analysis. And he thinks the world will work out just through the sheer force of American power and the center of gravity that America occupies. He will, through the magic of individual negotiations, work out an aggregate outcome that overcomes these contradictions in the actual measures. That's what I think is happening.
You've mentioned a couple of times that Trump has a vision. What do you think that vision is?
He's been pretty consistent, Daniel, over the past 30 years. He wants to bring back manufacturing. He wants to defend and restore American military primacy across the world, and he thinks those two things are connected. And he wants to, instead of using American resources to carry along a international coalition, what he wants to do is simply pummel the rest of the coalition into following the U.S. by virtue of its economic and military might. So it's bringing back manufacturing, renegotiating America's place in the world, and also changing the mechanisms by which America sustains its place in the world. A subsidiary, but I think real factor is I think he does want to deal with the national debt. I think he and the people around him are worried about a $30 trillion national debt, and they want to do something about that. That's about it, I think.
So I've got a question. How does the left critique fit in with the return of manufacturing? Because obviously the left has criticized neoliberal globalization, deindustrialization, the shipping of industries overseas. Clearly, we wouldn't have wanted this done in this haphazard, ridiculous, incredibly damaging way. But how does Trump's vision fit into that?
Well, the reason I'm hesitating to answer your question is you use this term, the left. And I don't know what it refers to.
Okay, fair enough. There's no left. What are the right-thinking, smart intellectuals who think about
I
these
wasn't being
things?
glib.
Because
Yeah, I really, the
I mean,
reason
I agree. I agree.
it's just that there's, under the rubric of the left, there are many different positions, right? So, like, to my mind, I don't think there's any particular reason to try to defend manufacturing in an advanced capitalist economy. And the reason for that is I'm not sure it's possible to. That the
I agree.
forces, the
I
forces
agree.
driving deindustrialization are not. It wasn't NAFTA that undermined manufacturing, and the simple reason is manufacturing has been declining all across the capitalist world, and the reason it's declining everywhere is the massive increases in labor productivity. There's not much you can do about this. I think the left critique ought to be not about restoring manufacturing per se, but about restoring social democracy and restoring the social insurance and the power of labor within the social democracy. Now, that's consistent with a targeted and limited use of tariffs. That's consistent with defending certain sectors in manufacturing. But the burden of proof is on anybody, left or right, who thinks you can reverse the deepest tectonic forces within capitalism and simply through dint of policy bring back manufacturing. So that's why, Danny, I wasn't trying to be glib. What I was simply saying was that, A, I'm not sure who we should take as the flag bearer of the left to answer the question, and B, if the left is saying that we need to in some way bring back manufacturing, I would say that that's a mistaken belief.
How should the left react to this then? I mean, because I tend to agree. What is it like? The manufacturing is 8 to 9% of the economy. So, how should the left react?
But not in value added. That's the thing. Like, in terms of manufacturing's importance to the economy, that has not declined very much. Manufacturing's importance to employment, yeah, we're in single digits now. And through a Herculean effort, you might go from 8% of employment to maybe 10 or 11. And that's an extraordinary achievement if you can do it. But it's still 1/3 of what it used to be in the 50s. And you're just not going to go back to the 50s. So in my opinion, what the left's position ought to be is to use a combination of state actions, that is to say, tariffs and industrial policy, but most importantly, legislation around the labor law and labor organizing to try to make it easier for workers to organize wherever they happen to be working, whether it's manufacturing, services, logistics, transportation, any of those things. That's the left's position. I would argue for that position within the left, but what he's doing, it's not clear who he's trying to do it for.
So what should the response be to it then? Like
to
criticism. Yeah, like the criticism. This is terrible, and we just need to.
I'm curious about this too. Like, what's an effective line of criticism that takes into account, the goals of the left, but doesn't veer into just like outright, protectionism, I guess.
Right. No, I think that the criticism is a short-term and a long-term one. So the short-term criticism has to be that this is going to be absolutely catastrophic for working people in the United States, and that the hit is going to come from 2 or 3 different directions. The first one, obviously, is that it's very likely to trigger a recession in a situation where the economy is actually doing very well. So it's an artificially induced recession. That recession is going to hit some of the poorest and worst off counties because it's going to hit hardest the tradable sectors. And the tradable sectors are the ones that have already been suffering the dint of deindustrialization and all the trade treaties that were done. Secondly, these tariffs so if you look at tariffs as a kind of taxation, what is a tariff? It's a way of instituting a tax on goods coming into the country. Well, all taxes that are sales taxes like this are regressive, which again means that it hits the working class and the poorest sections of the working class the hardest. So it's now doing 2 things, right? It's taking jobs away from the people who are already quite vulnerable, and for the people who don't suffer job loss, it's going to be now a regressive tax on small incomes that they already had. Thirdly, it's just not at all clear that one of his primary goals, which is to use the tariffs to increase government revenues, is actually going to be borne out, because government revenues are going to decline from the decline in economic activity, that the recession brings about, which means further pressure on social insurance and Medicaid and Medicare and social provisions. On top of that, if you add the fact that he's gutting social agencies through this psychotic unleashing of Musk, it means then not only are the revenues declining to make payments to people, but the social institutions, the instruments through which those checks might be delivered to them, are also being gutted. Every single component of this tariff madness and the Doge madness is hitting the poorest and the most vulnerable the hardest. And so the left criticism ought to be that this is the most naked expression of class power and class hatred that we've seen in 2 generations. We've never seen anything like this. The long-term,
it is truly wild, yeah.
The long-term criticism has to be the alternative to this is not bringing back the mainstream Democrats. And the reason for that is, while they will step back from the more maniacal and crazed elements of this program, what they seek to restore is the economy that put working people in this position of vulnerability, job loss, and eroding social security in the first place. So the long-term criticism has to be not a retreat from Trumpism, but a retreat from the entire neoliberal package that both parties have been sharing. For that, Daniel, again, not to be glib, for that you need a left. You don't need a Twitterati or social justice warriors or identitarians.
How dare you?
You need an actual left. And we're just in the very earliest stages of trying to even think about what that looks like, much less rebuild one.
No, I completely agree. And to me, that raises gigantic questions about organization in a post-industrial society, which no one has come up with a good answer to, as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly right.
I think co-ops are not enough. I think tenant unions are not enough. I think like the big question is, how do you get people to put their livelihoods on the line, themselves on the line, when they don't go to work every day and develop social relations with people? And that is a gigantic problem. But that's a little orthogonal. The question that I do want to ask, though, is there's been a lot of discussion about the decline of neoliberalism, the end of neoliberalism, Trump's emergent neo-mercantilism. But the way I see it is that we have a neoliberal political economy in the sense that literally the laws that allow financialization and monopolization are very obviously neoliberal in every way you want to define that term. But Trump is trying to do something different, something pre-neoliberal, something pre-Fordist with this neo-mercantilist foreign policy, the emphasis on basically gunboat diplomacy and tariffs. But what do you think is actually going on with neoliberalism? And how do you think what Trump is doing fits in, departs from, complements the neoliberal political economy that I think, at least structurally, we are still living in terms of the legal framework, the economic framework that defines U.S. and global economies?
Neoliberalism is a catchphrase. It's kind of a placeholder that the content of which varies depending on who you're talking to. So, for example, what you just described, the veering towards mercantilism, let's just define our terms just so we can make some progress. By mercantilism, what we mean is an economic doctrine of trade in which countries are thought to benefit only to the extent where they are bringing in more wealth than is going out of them. Now, in the bad old days of the early modern period when this doctrine originated, the wealth was associated with specie, gold or silver. And the whole point of trade was to bring in more gold or silver than is going out. In the modern era, where gold and silver aren't the mechanisms of trade, mercantilism is meant to share with classical mercantilism this one attribute, which is you vie for trade surpluses on your external account and try to avoid trade deficits. So the idea here is that instead of opening up your economy and letting it rip and see where the trade balance pans out, what you're going to try to do is engineer your place in the global economy so that you protect domestic industries from outside competition and you try to maximize your exports so that there's a positive balance on trade. Now, how does that relate to neoliberalism? Well, neoliberalism has as one of its core components free trade. And the expression of free trade in our era was what's called globalization. Globalization basically means value chains were allowed to spread across the world, and consumption wasn't limited to what is produced domestically. So Trump's mercantilism is a retreat from this dimension of neoliberalism. But it's only
at least it's tools. At least it's, I just want to emphasize, because I think he's using mercantile tools, but it's not necessarily a full-blown mercantilism in the way that you're describing, because you just can't do it in a highly financialized economy.
I mean, mercantilism is the tools, Danny. I'm not sure what the difference here is. Mercantilism refers to the principles behind your integration into the global economy and the instruments, the tools that you're using, which like protectionism, tariffs, things like that. Maybe what you're saying is that the end product will not be what the mercantilist dream is.
Well, do you think that Trump really wants to? I'm not sure that his vision of the economy really involves importing more or consuming more here and importing more than one gives out in the traditional 18th and 19th century definition of mercantilism. I don't think he even goes that far.
Well,
I think if you ask Trump, go.
He takes trade deficits to be equivalent to other countries exploiting the United States. So, which means that he wants trade surpluses with the rest of the world, which means that he really does want the United States to be buying less from the rest of the world and buying more domestically. So that is, to me, as far as I can understand what he's doing, that's consistent with the view of exporting more and importing less.
But he doesn't do it with like capital flows.
No, that's why I said.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So that this is to me the tension, right? Like finance and monopoly are just totally off the table. So he's only focusing on like trade of goods. It's very
no. In fact, he has to rely on capital movements if he really does want. Because remember, part of his thing is he wants the dollar to decline in value, but he still wants it to remain the reserve currency. Trump's entire program falls apart if its status as a reserve currency declines. So he can't be against at least a relatively open movement of capital across borders. And again, this goes back to the first question that Derek asked me: how's he going to implement his vision? Well, one of the things you see international financial investors coming back to again and again when they're asked, what do you want to see from a reserve currency? They say the rule of law and predictability. Because, man, we're putting tens of millions of dollars into your financial markets. We want to know that the legal apparatus around those financial markets is going to be respected by your state, and our rights as wealth holders will be respected by your state. So one of the things that Trump is doing, but through his erratic behavior and his complete willfulness toward laws, is he's actually threatening America's status as a reserve currency. Now, I don't think in the short run that's going to matter so much, because there's no alternative. The euro is not yet an alternative, and all this talk about BRICS is just a ridiculous fantasy that the BRICS
precisely fantasy,
absolute fantasy. So the dollar is very secure for the foreseeable future, but he is hammering away at some pretty important foundations of it. So back to your question about neoliberalism. There's a retreat from globalization in this modulated sense, yes, and that is a retreat from neoliberalism, yes, but the fundamental foundation of neoliberalism, which is to restore the prerogatives of capital and to reduce and diminish it and even obliterate the powers of labor, not only is that not been challenged, Trump is accelerating that. There's no question of a retreat from neoliberalism. It's out of the question.
I totally agree. And that's the answer I gave to a reporter the other day, essentially what you're saying. Just two more questions. The first one, and this is a very large one, so take it in whatever direction or not direction you want to go. What is going on with capitalism at this moment? Is it just another crisis? Typical crisis, and that's it, and it'll work itself out, and we have another one in 15 years, or is there something more profound?
Well, again, this depends on whether we want to conceptualize capitalism in this discussion purely as the economic phenomenon of accumulation and profitability, or if you want to include in your understanding of crisis its political dimensions, the state forms, the party systems, and the geopolitics. Now, if you expand your focus to these second group of institutions, politics, geopolitics, and things like that, the state, what's going on is in fact, a real political crisis. And it's been unfolding for 10 to 12 years now, I would say, at the very least. Neoliberal capitalism, in its multidimensional aspects, has been presiding over a fairly profound political crisis since around soon after 2010. And the reason for that is the tribulations, the rapacious exploitation of labor since the 1980s has reached a point where the anger of ordinary people is coming out in ways that the system's institutions cannot contain anymore. And the way in which they're trying to contain it has only accelerated the political crisis. So I'll give you an example. The rise of the far right in the past 10 years has been something that the political establishment did not want and tried to avert. That was a crisis of politics and neoliberalism. Their response has been to try to use the most draconian anti-democratic measures to try to expel the right from the political sphere, the result of which is to only further embolden and empower the right. They have no answer to this, they being centrist, social democratic, and bourgeois parties. They have no answer to it because the only answer to it is to try to have a more redistributive and egalitarian form of capitalism, which they will not allow.
They will not allow, Vivek, I just say this all the time. They're not going to do the thing. They're not going to do the redistribution. Whether you're the Democratic Party is just not going to do it. So nothing's going to change. I just want to underline that is my exact argument all the time.
It's out of the question. Watch what happens. Trump has just signed he's signed his death warrant with these, and I think they know it. I think that's another discussion. I think a lot of what he's doing is on the expectation that he's going to lose the midterm elections, right? But watch what happens. What's going to happen as he loses those elections is the Democrats will retreat from the insane kind of woke identitarianism that they deployed against Bernie Sanders and the left because it's backfired. But they're not going to heed Sanders's calls to go to a more pro-labor. What they're going to do is go back to a kind of Obama-esque neoliberalism, where it's soft identitarianism and a kind of genteel contempt for the poor rather than the aggressive hatred of the poor that you saw with Kamala Harris and her followers, right?
Yeah, and post-Trump. And I think that's why you're going to see similar to the fin de siècle politics of going back and forth between parties because parties, they're not going to do the coalition building that Roosevelt
Danny, and the result is the political crisis will continue. Now, underneath that is an economic dilemma that neoliberalism faces, which is that the refusal to attend to the consequences of freeing up labor markets, freeing up product markets, freeing up capital markets, the refusal to attend to that has resulted in a slowing down of economic growth over the past 20 years on both sides of the Atlantic. And that slower economic growth has raised the problem that conflicts over distribution have become more and more and more intense. They've become, for a while, they were more intense just in the elites, in the top 20%. And that's the essence of identity politics. The identitarian turn of the past 25 years has basically been push the poor out of the political system. And now the top 20% fights amongst itself as to who gets the goodies. And it's been around social identity that people have tried to mobilize a claim on the social surplus. Okay, now that's playing itself out. That is reaching its last stages. So the problem is you're coming back to the problem of how do we revive economic growth from a slow-growing capitalism to a faster-growing one. And that's where the current political elite, the left, the center, and the right, has no answers because they refuse to let go of the basic accumulation model that they're wedded to, which means that the political crisis is going to continue. I don't see any way out of it.
So, Vivek, I think we're approaching a good place to stop now. There's obviously a lot more to talk about here, but I wanted to ask you, I know there's a lot of uncertainty here because we don't even know what Trump is trying to do, or if Trump even knows what Trump is trying to do. We don't know how the rest of the world is going to respond yet, although I have seen it seems like China has gone full bore in their response. They've imposed, I think, 34% tariffs across the board on U.S. products. So that's a big one. That's a big kind of domino to fall. But we still don't know how other places are going to respond. So we can't really get into what the fallout is going to look like in a definitive sense. But what should people be looking for? You've alluded a few times to some very serious potential consequences here. As you kind of look ahead, and as people listening to this are trying to look ahead to what this may all mean, what are some things you would say they should be aware of or keep an eye out for?
Well, I think a recession is almost inevitable here. That there's going to be the economic dislocation from this is enormous, and I really do think Trump knows that, and that's why he rushed so fast to implement these tariffs, because he wants the recession as soon as possible, because he thinks that there'll be economic recovery by the time the 2028 elections roll around, and the Republican Party can ride the wave of that recovery. It's a huge gamble. I don't know if it's true, but I do believe that he has correctly anticipated that the midterm elections are going to be basically they'll coincide with the recession, and that means that he's going to lose his majorities, and people should expect then that this is essentially a 2-year presidency, in the sense that Trump by 2026 you should expect at the very latest, I think Congress is going to start minimally putting sand in the wheels of the Trump agenda. But even before that, there's going to be such a outcry, which I think Trump has underestimated, such an outcry in his own base to the effects of these tariffs and to the unleashing of this madman billionaire, Elon Musk. My feeling, and Derek, we've never lived through a time like this, so all of these are educated guesses, so take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. My feeling is that the Republicans are also you're going to start seeing fissures in the Republican Party within a few months, because essentially American capital and about half of the Republican Party detested Trump even as late as 2024, but has been willing to give him some rope for two reasons. One is that there was a hope that Trump would be, even in his first days, friendly to business, and that would help push back some of the Biden regulations and some of the hits business had taken under Biden. And the second was the tax law. The thing now is that I think this shock to the system is something that even Trump's tax ambitions won't be able to placate his critics within the American corporate community and within the Republican Party. So I would expect to start seeing a fight back even within the Republican Party in the near future, that is to say before the midterms. And finally, some reason for hope. His unprecedented attack on civil liberties, on speech, all of this stuff has been done knowing that the courts will overturn most of it, including the Supreme Court. Those cases are still making their way through the court system, and we haven't seen the first decisions come down. So all we've seen is the darkness of this horrible attack on rights that people have taken for granted for 200 years. I think hopefully in a couple of months, you'll start seeing the court's decisions coming down. And unless there's an absolute catastrophe, the courts are not going to support deportation of people for their views, the arrest of people for writing op-eds and things like that. Even this right-wing Supreme Court won't stand by that. So we have about 6 or 8 months to survive, to suffer through. And the worst of it will probably be over. And then we'll have to contend with business as usual in America, which is the baseline, slow, grinding attack on working people that both parties have been undertaking for 40 years now.
And the thing that gave us Donald Trump in the first place.
And will keep giving us Trump.
Wonderful. Yes.
That's right. Until there is a left that actually cares about working people instead of spitting on them constantly, until there's a left that organizes people, this is the reality we're going to be facing.
Well, we specialize in ending on depressing notes, so that's a good place to stop for us. Vivek, thank you so much for coming on the program. Folks, check out Catalyst, check out the podcast, Confronting Capitalism. Vivek, again, thanks so much for doing this, especially on short notice, and we would love to have you back anytime.
It was a pleasure, Derek. Thank you. Yes.